Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, before the wealthy Hawthorne family opened their eyes, Evelyn Carter quietly unlocked the back door of Hawthorne Manor and stepped into the cold morning air with a weathered metal watering can in her hand. The estate stretched across nearly 50 acres of rolling hills, outside the quiet town of Red Hollow, where old oak trees lined winding stone paths leading toward a mansion that looked more like a private palace than a family home. Gardeners admired the perfectly trimmed hedges. Visitors photographed the colorful roses blooming beside the marble fountain, but no one ever paid much attention to the smallest garden on the property. Hidden behind the west wing of the mansion stood a modest flower bed, surrounded by a white wooden fence. It contained nothing extraordinary. A few rose bushes, several patches of lavender, white lilies, and fresh daisies blooming throughout the seasons. Yet every single morning, regardless of heavy rain, freezing snow, scorching summer heat, or dangerous storms, Evelyn visited that tiny garden before doing anything else. She watered every flower by hand. She carefully removed every fallen leaf. She gently brushed dirt away from every stone as though speaking silently to someone beneath the earth. Then she smiled softly before returning inside the mansion to prepare breakfast for the family she had served for 15 years. No one questioned the routine anymore. Richard Hawthorne, the 74-year-old owner of the estate, often joked that Evelyn loved flowers more than people. His son Andrew laughed every time he heard it. Andrew's wife Victoria simply rolled her eyes and said old women always needed harmless hobbies to stay busy. Their teenage children called the place Grandma Evelyn's secret garden because she never allowed anyone else inside the fence. Even professional landscapers hired by the family were instructed to avoid touching it. When new employees asked why, the answer was always the same: because Evelyn requested it, and nobody had ever found a reason to refuse her. She had earned everyone's trust through years of quiet dedication. She never argued. She never raised her voice. She never called in sick. Every floor inside the mansion reflected her careful work. Every silver plate shined perfectly. Every bedroom smelled fresh. Every family celebration became flawless, because Evelyn noticed problems before anyone else did. Guests constantly praised the Hawthorne household for employing such a remarkable housekeeper. Richard often smiled proudly before replying that Evelyn was not an employee anymore. She was family. The words sounded kind, yet everyone understood they were only symbolic. Evelyn still lived alone inside a small cottage at the edge of the estate. She still earned a modest salary. She still ate dinner after everyone else had finished. Invisible people often become indispensable without ever becoming equal. Evelyn never complained. Every evening before returning home, she visited the garden one final time. She would kneel beside the oldest rose bush, close her eyes for several seconds, then quietly whisper words nobody could hear. Security cameras recorded the ritual hundreds of times across 15 years. Nobody ever watched the footage closely enough to wonder why. Red Hollow itself was the kind of town where nothing dramatic ever happened. Children rode bicycles safely through quiet streets. Neighbors never locked their front doors. The local newspaper filled empty pages with stories about school fundraisers and fishing competitions because real crime rarely existed. Police officers spent more time helping stranded drivers than chasing criminals. Everyone knew everyone. Outsiders often described the town as peaceful. Evelyn described it differently. She once quietly told the local librarian that silence could hide terrible things. The librarian laughed politely, assuming the old woman enjoyed speaking in mysterious riddles. Evelyn simply smiled and borrowed another history book. She read constantly. Most people expected novels or gardening magazines, but Evelyn always checked out books about criminal investigations, forensic science, missing persons, and federal court cases. The librarian eventually asked whether she had considered becoming a detective instead of a housekeeper. Evelyn answered with the same gentle smile she always wore. Sometimes the people cleaning the room notice more than the people sitting inside it. The librarian laughed again. Years later, those words would return to haunt her. On the first Monday of October, after 3 days of relentless rain, The county ordered emergency repairs to an aging water line runneath the western edge of the Hawthorne estate. Heavy machinery arrived shortly after sunrise. Construction workers marked underground utility lines, while supervisors reviewed old property maps that had not been updated in decades. One bright orange marker landed directly beside Evelyn's flower garden. The construction foreman politely approached her while she finished watering the roses. He removed his hard hat and apologized for the inconvenience. The pipe had burst beneath the garden, and they would need to dig through part of the flower bed to replace it. Evelyn looked at the small wooden fence for several long seconds. Her smile slowly disappeared for the first time anyone could remember. Then she quietly asked one question: "Is there any other way?" The foreman shook his head with genuine regret. Underground water pressure had already begun damaging the mansion's foundation. Delaying repairs could cost millions of dollars. Evelyn nodded once. She thanked him politely, picked up her watering can, and slowly walked back toward the house. Richard Hawthorne noticed something unusual during breakfast. Evelyn forgot to place sugar beside his coffee. In 15 years, she had never forgotten anything. Andrew joked that retirement must finally be catching up with her. Evelyn apologized immediately, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the silver sugar bowl. Victoria watched the old woman more carefully than usual. Something about Evelyn's eyes looked different. Not frightened, not angry, resigned, as though she had expected this morning for a very long time. Outside, engines roared to life. Excavators rolled across the wet lawn toward the little white fence. Workers carefully removed the wooden posts before lifting the first section of flowers. Several gardeners offered to transplant the roses safely before excavation began. Evelyn quietly refused. She insisted on removing each plant herself. One by one she carried the flowers into neat rows beside the cottage, gently brushing mud from every root before setting them down. She treated each rose with extraordinary care, almost like carrying fragile memories instead of plants. By noon only bare earth remained inside the fenced garden. The construction crew began digging. Less than 3 feet below the surface, one worker suddenly struck something solid. Everyone assumed it was old concrete. He climbed into the trench with a shovel and carefully cleared away the wet soil. Seconds later, he stopped moving completely. His face turned pale. He slowly looked toward the foreman without speaking. The foreman stepped into the trench beside him. Neither man said a word. Resting beneath the dark earth was a human hand, still wearing a rusted wedding ring. Within 20 minutes, the construction site became an active crime scene. Police vehicles filled the estate. Yellow evidence tape surrounded the garden Evelyn had protected for 15 years. As detectives secured the area, Evelyn stood quietly on the mansion porch with her hands folded in front of her. She never attempted to leave. She never asked questions. She simply watched the investigators begin uncovering the truth she had buried beneath the flowers, and for the first time in 15 years, she did not smile. The rain continued falling as flashing blue and red lights reflected across the wet windows of Hawthorne Manor. News traveled through Red Hollow faster than anyone expected. By sunset, every television station within 200 miles had interrupted regular programming to report that human remains had been discovered beneath the flower garden of the beloved Hawthorne estate. Helicopters circled overhead while reporters gathered behind police barricades, hoping to capture the first glimpse of the quiet housekeeper, whose peaceful smile had suddenly become the face of a murder investigation. Detective Daniel Brooks arrived shortly after noon. 48 years old, calm under pressure, and known for solving several complex homicide cases, Brooks had spent nearly 25 years investigating violent crime. The moment he stepped across the yellow tape, he noticed something unusual. Crime scenes usually felt chaotic. Families cried. Witnesses argued. Suspects lied. Here, everyone was simply watching one woman standing silently on the front porch. Evelyn Carter neither protested nor defended herself. She simply waited. Brooks approached slowly and introduced himself. Evelyn nodded politely before asking whether the workers had damaged the roses. The detective blinked in surprise. You're worried about the flowers. Evelyn looked toward the empty garden. The flowers can always grow again. She paused for several seconds before quietly adding, some things cannot. Brooks studied her face carefully. He expected panic. Instead, he found sadness. Not the sadness of someone caught hiding a crime, but the sadness of someone watching an old promise finally come to an end. Forensic investigators carefully uncovered the first skeleton. The remains belonged to an adult male. Time had reduced nearly everything to bone, yet fragments of clothing still remained beneath layers of wet soil. Around one wrist, investigators discovered rusted metal that looked like a broken handcuff. Several officers exchanged confused looks. Brooks crouched beside the grave and quietly asked the forensic anthropologist for an estimate. The scientist believed the body had rested beneath the garden for at least 15 years, possibly much longer. Before Brooks could respond, another investigator called from only a few feet away. A second set of human remains had appeared beneath the same flower bed. The silence surrounding the excavation immediately changed. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Every shovel entered the soil more carefully than before. Within another hour, the second skeleton emerged, then a third, then a fourth. 4 bodies lay beneath the small garden Evelyn had protected every day for 15 years. Television helicopters captured every moment from above. News anchors called it one of the most shocking discoveries in recent state history. Social media exploded with headlines describing Evelyn as a smiling serial killer who had hidden victims beneath roses while serving breakfast to one of the wealthiest families in the county. Reporters replayed old photographs of her tending flowers with gentle hands. Suddenly, every smile looked sinister. Every act of kindness became suspicious. Neighbors who once praised her generosity now told cameras they had always sensed something strange about the quiet housekeeper. Brooks ignored the speculation. Evidence mattered more than rumors. He ordered officers to escort Evelyn into the mansion library for questioning. She followed without resistance. Inside the elegant room lined with leather books and antique paintings, Brooks placed a recorder on the table. Evelyn folded her hands calmly and waited. "Do you know why you're here?" Brooks asked. "Yes." "Did you know there were bodies beneath the garden?" "Yes." Brooks looked up from his notebook. "You buried them?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Yes." The room fell silent. One detective quietly exhaled while another stopped writing altogether. Brooks leaned forward. "Did you kill them?" Evelyn met his eyes. "No." "Then whose bodies are they?" Evelyn looked toward the rain-covered window before answering. "People who deserve to be found." Brooks frowned. "Explain." She slowly shook her head. "Not yet." Brooks changed direction. "Why keep them hidden for 15 years?" Evelyn answered so softly the recorder almost failed to capture her voice. "Because the wrong people were still alive." Before Brooks could ask another question, a forensic technician hurried into the library carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside rested an old leather wallet recovered from the first skeleton. Despite years beneath the soil, one laminated identification card remained partially readable. Brooks carefully removed it using gloves. The photograph had faded, but the name beneath it was still visible. His expression changed immediately. The man had once worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Not as an agent, as a confidential informant assigned to one of the largest organized crime investigations in the region 20 years earlier. Official records listed him as missing. His body had never been found. Until now. Brooks slowly looked back toward Evelyn. "How did an FBI informant end up in your garden?" Evelyn quietly replied, "He asked me not to let them disappear him." Brooks felt a chill move through his spine. "Who?" Evelyn looked directly at him. "The people wearing badges." At almost the same moment, another forensic examiner entered carrying fresh identification from the second skeleton. This victim had once served as a state judge before disappearing 17 years earlier during a corruption investigation that had abruptly ended without explanation. Brooks stared at the file in disbelief. 2 missing people connected to high-level criminal investigations, buried together. hidden beneath roses. He immediately ordered state authorities to notify the FBI. Within an hour, federal agents were already on their way to Red Hollow. Outside the mansion, reporters continued broadcasting live as police escorted Evelyn toward a patrol vehicle. Cameras flashed nonstop while angry spectators shouted accusations across the barricades. Some called her a murderer. Others demanded the death penalty before the investigation had barely begun. Evelyn never looked toward them. As officers helped her into the back seat, one elderly woman standing in the crowd suddenly cried out, "Why did you do it?" Evelyn turned her head slightly toward the voice. For the first time since sunrise, a faint smile returned to her face. "I didn't bury the truth," she answered quietly. "I buried the only proof that survived." The patrol car door closed. None of the reporters understood what she meant. But Detective Brooks did not stop thinking about those words. Something about this case refused to fit together. Murderers hid bodies because they feared discovery. Evelyn had buried 4 people together beneath the most carefully maintained place on the entire estate. She had protected that exact location every single day for 15 years, almost as though she wanted the bodies preserved rather than forgotten. As the police convoy pulled away from Hawthorne Manor, Brooks received a secure phone call from FBI headquarters. The voice on the other end sounded unusually serious. "Detective Brooks," the agent said, "stop questioning Evelyn Carter immediately." Brooks frowned. Why? There was a long pause before the answer came. Because according to classified federal records. Another pause followed. Evelyn Carter officially died 16 years. Detective Daniel Brooks remained frozen beside his patrol car as rain soaked his jacket, and the voice from FBI headquarters repeated the sentence that made no sense. Evelyn Carter officially died 16 years ago. Brooks looked through the rear window of the police vehicle. Evelyn sat quietly with both hands resting on her lap, looking out at the passing fields as though nothing unusual had happened. She showed no fear, no panic, no urgency. She looked like a woman who had spent many years waiting for this exact day. Brooks immediately ordered the convoy to divert to the county sheriff's office instead of the local jail. If the FBI was involved, ordinary booking procedures could destroy valuable evidence. Inside headquarters, officers were already overwhelmed. News channels played nonstop in the lobby. Reporters gathered outside the building demanding statements. Social media had transformed Evelyn into the most infamous woman in America within only 6 hours. Some called her a serial killer. Others believed she was protecting a cult. Conspiracy theories spread faster than verified facts. Brooks ignored every screen and escorted Evelyn into a secure interview room. She quietly thanked the deputy who offered her a cup of coffee. Even that simple gesture unsettled everyone watching through the observation window. Most suspects asked for lawyers. Evelyn asked whether the deputy had remembered to eat lunch. 20 minutes later, 3 black SUVs arrived outside the sheriff's office. 4 FBI agents entered without speaking to anyone. Leading them was Special Agent Rebecca Collins, a veteran investigator known for dismantling organized crime networks across several states. She placed a classified folder on the interview table before looking directly at Brooks. "Where did you find her?" Brooks answered carefully. "Working as a housekeeper for the Hawthorne family." Rebecca opened the folder. Inside was a photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. The woman in the picture looked younger, but there was no doubt it was Evelyn. Only the name beneath the photograph was different. Not Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Hayes, Federal Witness Protection Program. Brooks slowly looked back at Evelyn through the observation glass. Rebecca continued speaking in a lower voice. 16 years ago, her transport convoy disappeared. Brooks frowned. Disappeared. Rebecca nodded. 3 federal marshals. 2 protected witnesses. 1 civilian courier. She paused. The official report concluded everyone died after their vehicle exploded in a canyon fire. Brooks felt another chill. If she survived. Rebecca finished the sentence. Then someone lied to the federal government. Inside the interview room, Evelyn quietly stirred sugar into her coffee, although she had never asked for any. Rebecca entered alone and closed the heavy steel door behind her. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Rebecca placed the old photograph on the table. "Good morning, Evelyn Hayes." Evelyn looked down at the picture. Her gentle smile faded. "I haven't heard that name in a very long time." Rebecca sat opposite her. "Because according to Washington, you're dead." Evelyn nodded once. "That was the idea." Rebecca leaned forward. "Who wanted you dead?" Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes. "The people who survived." Rebecca remained silent. She had interviewed cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and professional assassins. None had spoken with Evelyn's calm certainty. She was not inventing answers. She was remembering them. Rebecca opened another file. "Tell me about the convoy." Evelyn stared at the tabletop for several seconds before speaking. "There were 6 of us." Her voice became quieter. "We left before sunrise. Nobody knew the route except the marshals." She stopped. "Or at least that's what we believed." The room seemed colder as she continued. 40 minutes of the drive, another vehicle blocked the mountain road. "They knew our exact location." Rebecca quickly interrupted. "How many attackers?" Evelyn answered immediately. 8. Military training, most of them." "How did you survive?" Evelyn closed her eyes. Memories she had buried for years slowly resurfaced. "The explosion threw me into the river below the bridge." Rebecca waited. "The current carried me nearly 3 miles. Evelyn looked toward the ceiling as though watching the past unfold. "When I climbed onto the riverbank, I walked back." Rebecca frowned. "Back to the convoy?" Evelyn nodded. Everyone was already dead. Silence filled the room. Rebecca quietly asked, "The witnesses?" Evelyn swallowed slowly. "Executed. The marshals. Shot after surrendering." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Did you report it?" Evelyn gave a tired smile. "I tried." She reached into her pocket. Every officer behind the observation glass instantly tensed, but she simply removed an old silver coin worn smooth by time. She placed it carefully on the table. "I drove to the nearest sheriff's office." She paused. "The sheriff already knew my name." Rebecca did not interrupt. "He answered the telephone before I entered." Evelyn continued. "He looked at me and said, 'You're supposed to be dead, Brooks.'" Watching through the glass, felt his heartbeat quicken. Evelyn looked directly at Rebecca. "That's when I understood." "Understood what?" Rebecca asked. Evelyn answered with absolute certainty. "The people hunting us wore uniforms too." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rebecca finally asked the question that had haunted investigators for years. "Then why disappear?" Evelyn looked down at the silver coin. "Because I was carrying something they never found." Rebecca frowned. Evelyn slowly slid the coin across the table. "Not this." She smiled faintly. "Something much bigger." Before Rebecca could ask another question, her secure phone vibrated. She stepped into the hallway to answer. 30 seconds later, she returned with a face that had completely changed. Brooks immediately knew something terrible had happened. Rebecca quietly closed the interview room door again. "Evelyn," she said, while we were talking. She hesitated. "Someone broke into the federal evidence vault in Washington." Evelyn did not look surprised. Rebecca continued. "Every file connected to your witness protection case has been destroyed." Evelyn simply nodded. "They're awake now." Brooks stepped into the room. "Who?" Evelyn slowly turned toward him. "The people who thought I died 16 years ago." Before either investigator could respond, every computer inside the sheriff's office suddenly went black. Emergency lights flickered once. Then a single message appeared on every monitor in the building. "Stop digging. There are still 3 more gardens." Nobody inside the sheriff's office spoke after the message appeared across every monitor. "Stop digging. There are still 3 more gardens." Seconds later, every screen went dark. Emergency generators activated automatically, but the message had already disappeared. FBI cyber specialists immediately disconnected the building from the internet. Local deputies checked every security camera. Nobody had entered or left the property. Yet someone had breached a secure federal communication network in less than 10 seconds. Special Agent Rebecca Collins stared at the blank monitor before quietly asking, "How many people knew about the excavation before today?" Detective Daniel Brooks answered without hesitation. Construction workers, the Hawthorne family, local police, county officials. Rebecca slowly shook her head. No. She looked toward Evelyn through the interview room window. Someone knew 15 years ago. Brooks followed her gaze. Evelyn remained seated exactly where she had been, calmly drinking her coffee, as though the chaos surrounding her belonged to someone else's life. Rebecca entered the interview room again carrying a printed copy of the message. She placed it on the table. "What does it mean?" Evelyn studied the paper for several seconds before quietly asking a different question. "Did they mention locations?" Rebecca frowned. No. No. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then they don't know where the other gardens are." Brooks immediately leaned forward. "Other gardens?" Evelyn looked directly at him. There were 4. Silence filled the room. Brooks slowly opened his notebook again. "You buried 4 groups of evidence." Evelyn gently corrected him. "I protected 4 crime scenes." Rebecca carefully watched every expression crossing Evelyn's face. "How many bodies?" Evelyn closed her eyes. "Not every garden contains people." Brooks felt another chill. "Then what's buried there?" Evelyn answered with complete certainty. "Truth." Rebecca remained silent, allowing Evelyn to continue. "After the convoy attack, I understood that every government office I visited had already been compromised. Police, courts, medical examiners, even some federal agencies." She paused. "Every witness who tried to expose them disappeared." Brooks quietly asked, "Who are they?" Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Back then I didn't know." She looked down at her hands. "I only knew one thing." Rebecca waited. "If I handed the evidence to the authorities," Evelyn finished softly, "the evidence would vanish before sunrise." Brooks looked toward Rebecca. The possibility sounded unbelievable, yet the destroyed federal files suggested Evelyn might be telling the truth. Rebecca removed another folder from her briefcase. "The first skeleton has been identified." Evelyn nodded as though she had expected the news hours earlier. Rebecca opened the report. "Michael Turner, confidential FBI informant. Missing for 19 years. Evelyn whispered his name almost affectionately. "He liked fishing." Brooks looked surprised. Evelyn continued. "He talked about teaching his grandson to catch trout after entering witness protection." She smiled sadly. "He never met him." Rebecca turned another page. "The second victim was Judge Harold Simmons." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "He carried peppermints everywhere." Another page. "The third victim, investigative journalist Laura Bennett." Evelyn quietly nodded. She laughed every time she was nervous. Rebecca hesitated before reading the final report. "The fourth victim." She looked directly at Evelyn. "There are no fingerprints, no dental records, no DNA match." Evelyn's breathing slowed. Brooks immediately noticed the change. "You know who it is?" Evelyn answered almost in a whisper. "Yes." Rebecca asked carefully. "Who?" Evelyn looked toward the rain-covered window. "The only honest federal marshal left alive that day." Brooks frowned. "Alive?" Evelyn slowly nodded. "Until he wasn't." Rebecca immediately understood. "He never escaped the convoy." Evelyn answered quietly. "He stayed behind so I could run." Silence settled over the room. Even Brooks stopped writing. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and removed an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She carefully placed it on the table between them. Rebecca looked at the worn metal. "What's this?" Evelyn answered, "Garden 2. Brooks stared at the key. "You know where it is?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I've always known." Rebecca leaned forward. "Then tell us." Evelyn slowly pushed the key toward Rebecca. "There's an abandoned greenhouse outside Mill Creek." Brooks immediately recognized the location. The greenhouse had belonged to a botanical research center destroyed by fire nearly 20 years earlier. Nobody had visited the property since. Evelyn continued. Beneath the center table you'll find a steel box. Rebecca asked, "What's inside?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. Every original photograph taken after the convoy attack. Brooks felt his pulse quicken. Those photographs would prove the murders happened exactly as Evelyn described. Rebecca immediately contacted the nearest FBI tactical team. Within 15 minutes, helicopters were airborne toward Mill Creek. While they waited for updates, Brooks quietly asked the question that had troubled him since the investigation began. "Why flowers?" Evelyn looked at him with tired eyes. "Because flowers grow where people stop looking." Brooks frowned. Evelyn continued, "Everyone remembers monuments." She smiled gently. "Nobody remembers gardens." 2 hours later, Rebecca's secure radio suddenly came to life. The voice of the tactical commander sounded breathless. "Agent Collins," he paused. "We found the greenhouse." Rebecca immediately asked, "And?" "The steel box is here." Brooks leaned closer. "Open it." There was a long silence. Then the commander's voice returned, noticeably different. "My God." Rebecca gripped the radio tighter. "What did you find?" The commander answered slowly. "Thousands of photographs." He paused again. "Every victim was photographed after death." Brooks felt sick. "Is that all?" The commander took a deep breath before speaking again. "No." Another pause followed. "There's also a handwritten map," Rebecca asked quietly. "Showing what?" The commander's voice almost disappeared beneath the sound of heavy rain. "Every location where the organization buried evidence over the last 30 years. Brooks closed his eyes. Rebecca slowly looked back toward Evelyn. Evelyn had never been hiding 4 murders. She had been preserving the largest collection of evidence against a nationwide criminal conspiracy. Then the commander's voice returned one final time. "Agent Collins." "Yes?" "The map doesn't mark 4 gardens." He swallowed audibly. "It marks 40. The sheriff's office became completely silent after Rebecca Collins placed the photograph on the conference table. Every investigator leaned closer. The image had been taken only an hour earlier. Fresh tire tracks surrounded the cemetery. Damp soil covered the grass. Richard Carter's grave had been dug open with professional precision. The granite headstone remained untouched, but the coffin beneath it had disappeared. Detective Daniel Brooks looked back and forth between the photograph and Evelyn Carter. He had expected grief. Instead, she simply closed her eyes for several seconds before quietly whispering, "They were too late." Brooks frowned. "Too late for what?" Evelyn slowly opened her eyes. "Richard isn't there." Rebecca immediately ordered deputies to secure the cemetery, while an FBI tactical unit rushed toward the location. Satellite surveillance was requested. Highway patrol blocked every road leaving Red Hollow. Helicopters lifted into the air once again. Evelyn remained seated without saying another word. Brooks could no longer ignore the growing mystery surrounding the man buried beneath the missing coffin. "Who was Richard Carter?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled for the first time since the excavation began. It was not the smile of relief. It was the smile of someone remembering a life that no longer existed. "My husband." Brooks nodded. "What did you do before he died?" Evelyn answered quietly. "Officially." Brooks looked confused. Yes. He repaired clocks." Brooks waited. Evelyn continued. "Unofficially, he built hiding places." Rebecca slowly turned toward her. "For witnesses?" Evelyn nodded once. "For evidence." The room became silent again. Rebecca placed another photograph on the table. It showed Richard Carter standing outside a small clock repair shop nearly 18 years earlier. Nothing about the man looked remarkable. Gray hair, thin glasses, worn work clothes, the kind of face people forgot seconds after walking past it. Evelyn gently touched the corner of the photograph. "That was exactly why they chose him." Brooks frowned. "Who chose him?" Evelyn answered immediately. "The Marshal's Service." She explained that Richard had never carried a badge. He never arrested criminals. He never testified in court. His talent was different. He could build hidden compartments inside almost anything. Furniture, walls, floors, church altars, cemetery monuments, even children's toys. Entire witness protection operations had relied on hiding documents where nobody would think to search. Rebecca quietly asked, "Did he know about the convoy?" Evelyn nodded. "He designed the emergency storage plan." Brooks leaned forward. "Storage plan?" Evelyn slowly folded her hands together. If every witness died, the evidence would survive. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. The gardens. Evelyn smiled sadly. Richard designed all 47. Brooks felt another shock. The quiet clockmaker had secretly created one of the largest evidence preservation systems in American history. Every garden, every hidden box, every burial site. Every location had been carefully planned years before the convoy attack. Richard had expected betrayal long before it happened. Rebecca immediately contacted the forensic team, examining the greenhouse documents. Search every page for Richard Carter. 20 minutes later, the answer arrived. The technicians had found dozens of architectural drawings, signed only with the initials RC. Hidden beneath layers of coded measurements were blueprints for underground vaults, reinforced containers, and waterproof evidence chambers. Richard had engineered the entire network. Brooks looked back toward Evelyn. Why fake his death? Evelyn lowered her eyes. Because they were already hunting him. She explained that after the convoy massacre, Richard disappeared completely. 3 years later, a body believed to be his was discovered inside a burned vehicle. Dental records confirmed the identification. The case was closed. Evelyn buried him beneath the oldest tree in Red Hollow Cemetery. She visited every Sunday for 15 years. Brooks quietly asked, "Was it really him?" Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. "I never saw the body." Rebecca slowly stood up. "You mean?" Evelyn finished the sentence. "Richard may still be alive." Before anyone could respond, an FBI agent hurried into the conference room carrying a sealed evidence envelope recovered from the cemetery only minutes earlier. "Agent Collins." Rebecca accepted the package and carefully removed a small brass object wrapped inside protective cloth. It was an old pocket watch. The cover bore a deeply engraved inscription. "Every truth deserves its own time." Evelyn gasped softly the moment she saw it. Her hands began trembling. Brooks had never seen her lose composure before. "You recognize it?" Evelyn nodded. Tears slowly filled her eyes. "Richard made this the week we married." Rebecca carefully opened the watch. Instead of gears, the inside contained a tightly folded strip of paper protected beneath crystal glass. Brooks unfolded it with gloved hands. Written in Richard Carter's unmistakably neat handwriting were only 2 sentences. "If you are reading this, they found my grave before they found me. Do not trust the Attorney General." He was never the highest person involved. Every person inside the room stared at the note in stunned silence. Brooks slowly looked toward Rebecca. "If the Attorney General isn't at the top," Rebecca finished the thought before he could. "Then someone above the federal government has been protecting this conspiracy." Before anyone could speak again, every light inside the sheriff's office suddenly went out. Emergency generators failed. Computers shut down. Radios fell silent. The building disappeared into complete darkness. Then, from somewhere outside, a church bell rang exactly 7 times. When the backup lights finally flickered on 30 seconds later, Evelyn Carter's interview room was empty. The handcuffs still rested on the table. The security cameras had recorded nothing. The only new object inside the room was a single fresh white rose lying neatly on Evelyn's chair. Attached to its stem was a handwritten note. "Garden 7 has already opened itself." The sheriff's office became completely silent after Rebecca Collins placed the photograph on the conference table. Every investigator leaned closer. The image had been taken only an hour earlier. Fresh tire tracks surrounded the cemetery. Damp soil covered the grass. Richard Carter's grave had been dug open with professional precision. The granite headstone remained untouched, but the coffin beneath it had disappeared. Detective Daniel Brooks looked back and forth between the photograph and Evelyn Carter. He had expected grief. Instead, she simply closed her eyes for several seconds before quietly whispering, "They were too late." Brooks frowned. Too late for what? Evelyn slowly opened her eyes. Richard isn't there. Rebecca immediately ordered deputies to secure the cemetery, while an FBI tactical unit rushed toward the location. Satellite surveillance was requested. Highway patrol blocked every road leaving Red Hollow. Helicopters lifted into the air once again. Evelyn remained seated without saying another word. Brooks could no longer ignore the growing mystery surrounding the man buried beneath the missing coffin. Who was Richard Carter? He asked softly. Evelyn smiled for the first time since the excavation began. It was not the smile of relief. It was the smile of someone remembering a life that no longer existed. My husband. Brooks nodded. What did he do before he died? Evelyn answered quietly. Officially, Brooks looked confused. Yes, he repaired clocks. Brooks waited. Evelyn continued. Unofficially, he built hiding places. Rebecca slowly turned toward her. For witnesses. Evelyn nodded once. For evidence. The room became silent again. Rebecca placed another photograph on the table. It showed Richard Carter standing outside a small clock repair shop nearly 18 years earlier. Nothing about the man looked remarkable. Gray hair, thin glasses, worn work clothes, the kind of face people forgot seconds after walking past it. Evelyn gently touched the corner of the photograph. That was exactly why they chose him. Brooks frowned. Who chose him? Evelyn answered immediately. The Marshal's Service. She explained that Richard had never carried a badge. He never arrested criminals. He never testified in court. His talent was different. He could build hidden compartments inside almost anything. Furniture, walls, floors, church altars, cemetery monuments, even children's toys. Entire witness protection operations had relied on hiding documents where nobody would think to search. Rebecca quietly asked, "Did he know about the convoy?" Evelyn nodded. He designed the emergency storage plan. Brooks leaned forward. Storage plan. Evelyn slowly folded her hands together. If every witness died, the evidence would survive. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. The gardens. Evelyn smiled sadly. Richard designed all 47. Brooks felt another shock. The quiet clockmaker had secretly created one of the largest evidence preservation systems in American history. Every garden, every hidden box, every burial site. Every location had been carefully planned years before the convoy attack. Richard had expected betrayal long before it happened. Rebecca immediately contacted the forensic team examining the greenhouse documents. Search every page for Richard Carter. 20 minutes later, the answer arrived. The technicians had found dozens of architectural drawings, signed only with the initials RC. Hidden beneath layers of coded measurements were blueprints for underground vaults, reinforced containers, and waterproof evidence chambers. Richard had engineered the entire network. Brooks looked back toward Evelyn. Why fake his death? Evelyn lowered her eyes. Because they were already hunting him. She explained that after the convoy massacre, Richard disappeared completely. 3 years later, a body believed to be his was discovered inside a burned vehicle. Dental records confirmed the identification. The case was closed. Evelyn buried him beneath the oldest tree in Red Hollow Cemetery. She visited every Sunday for 15 years. Brooks quietly asked, "Was it really him?" Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. "I never saw the body." Rebecca slowly stood up. "You mean?" Evelyn finished the sentence. "Richard may still be alive." Before anyone could respond, an FBI agent hurried into the conference room, carrying a sealed evidence envelope recovered from the cemetery only minutes earlier. Agent Collins. Rebecca accepted the package and carefully removed a small brass object wrapped inside protective cloth. It was an old pocket watch. The cover bore a deeply engraved inscription. "Every truth deserves its own time." Evelyn gasped softly the moment she saw it. Her hands began trembling. Brooks had never seen her lose composure before. "You recognize it?" Evelyn nodded. Tears slowly filled her eyes. "Richard made this the week we married." Rebecca carefully opened the watch. Instead of gears, the inside contained a tightly folded strip of paper protected beneath crystal glass. Brooks unfolded it with gloved hands. Written in Richard Carter's unmistakably neat handwriting were only 2 sentences. If you are reading this, they found my grave before they found me. Do not trust the Attorney General. He was never the highest person involved. Every person inside the room stared at the note in stunned silence. Brooks slowly looked toward Rebecca. If the Attorney General isn't at the top. Rebecca finished before he could. Then someone above the federal government has been protecting this conspiracy. Before anyone could speak again, every light inside the sheriff's office suddenly went out. Emergency generators failed, computers shut down, radios fell silent. The building disappeared into complete darkness. Then, from somewhere outside, a church bell rang exactly 7 times. When the backup lights finally flickered on 30 seconds later, Evelyn Carter's interview room was empty. The handcuffs still rested on the table. The security cameras had recorded nothing. The only new object inside the room was a single fresh white rose lying neatly on Evelyn's chair. Attached to its stem was a handwritten note. Garden 7 has already opened itself. For 3 long seconds, nobody inside the sheriff's office moved. Detective Daniel Brooks stared through the observation window at the empty interview room, where Evelyn Carter had been sitting less than half a minute earlier. The steel handcuffs remained locked around the heavy metal ring bolted to the table. The untouched cup of coffee still released thin trails of steam into the air. The white rose rested neatly on Evelyn's chair, as though someone had carefully placed it there after she vanished. Brooks rushed into the room with Rebecca Collins and 4 tactical agents close behind. There was only one door. It had remained locked the entire time. The reinforced window had never opened. Ceiling panels were sealed. Air vents measured barely 6 inches wide. Every escape route had already been eliminated during the building's construction years earlier. Rebecca immediately ordered technicians to replay every camera recording. The security footage showed the lights going out at exactly 4:17 p.m. For 31 seconds, every camera displayed complete darkness. When the emergency system restored power, Evelyn was gone. Nobody entered. Nobody exited. Brooks watched the footage repeatedly until his eyes began hurting. There had to be an explanation. People could not simply disappear from locked rooms. One young technician suddenly slowed the recording frame by frame. During the final instant, before total darkness, another shadow briefly appeared beside Evelyn's chair. It lasted less than 1/10 of a second. Too fast to identify. Too distorted to recognize. Rebecca quietly whispered. Someone was already inside the room before the lights failed. Brooks felt another chill. Whoever had taken Evelyn had somehow entered a secure interview room without appearing on any camera. The white rose was carefully collected as evidence. Forensic specialists found no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, only a faint scent of old cedar wood. Rebecca unfolded the handwritten note attached to the stem once again. Garden 7 has already opened itself. Brooks spread the recovered map across the conference table. 47 gardens, each marked only with a number. They quickly located Garden 7. It stood nearly 200 miles away in the abandoned mining town of Briar Ridge. According to property records, the location had once been a small community church surrounded by apple trees. The church burned down 22 years earlier after an electrical fire. Nothing remained except the stone foundation and an overgrown cemetery. Rebecca immediately assembled 2 helicopters. Brooks insisted on joining the mission. 4 hours later, just before sunrise, the FBI task force landed outside Briar Ridge. Thick fog covered the abandoned town. Broken storefronts lined empty streets where nobody had lived for nearly 2 decades. Wind pushed loose shutters against cracked windows, producing hollow echoes that seemed to follow the agents through the silence. The old church stood exactly where the map predicted. Blackened stone walls surrounded an empty foundation filled with weeds. Rebecca ordered forensic teams to begin scanning the ground. Before anyone touched the soil, Brooks noticed something strange beneath the collapsed bell tower. Fresh footprints. They could not have been more than an hour old. Someone had reached Garden 7 before the FBI. Tactical agents carefully followed the trail into the ruined basement beneath the church. Hidden behind fallen beams, they discovered a narrow iron door secured with an antique mechanical lock. Brooks removed the brass key Evelyn had given Rebecca the previous day. It fit perfectly. The heavy door slowly opened. Cold air escaped from below, carrying the unmistakable smell of aged paper rather than decay. The underground chamber had survived the fire untouched. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of carefully labeled archive boxes filled the room. Waterproof containers lined the walls in perfect rows. Everything remained clean despite decades underground. Rebecca looked around in disbelief. "This isn't another grave." Brooks slowly nodded. "It's a library." Agents immediately began opening the nearest containers. Inside they found original police reports, sealed court transcripts, cassette recordings, handwritten diaries, financial ledgers, newspaper negatives, witness statements, and photographs dating back more than 30 years. Every box documented crimes that had officially remained unsolved. Every file connected to judges, journalists, investigators, or witnesses who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One young analyst suddenly held up a thick binder labeled only with a handwritten letter H. Rebecca opened it carefully. Inside rested dozens of photographs showing Richard Hawthorne, the elderly owner of Hawthorne Manor, meeting secretly with federal prosecutors almost 20 years earlier. Brooks frowned. The Hawthorne family. Rebecca continued turning pages. Richard Hawthorne had not simply owned the mansion where Evelyn worked. He had secretly financed multiple investigations into organized corruption before abruptly retiring from public life. Another folder contained photographs of anonymous threats mailed to his family. Another documented several failed assassination attempts that had never reached the media. Brooks slowly looked up. He knew. Rebecca answered quietly. More than that. She placed one final photograph on the table. It showed Richard Hawthorne beside Richard Carter. The two men were shaking hands in front of the unfinished mansion 26 years earlier. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 6 words in blue ink. "The safest vault wears a family name." Brooks suddenly understood. Hawthorne Manor had never been chosen because Evelyn needed employment. She had chosen the mansion because Richard Hawthorne had been protecting the conspiracy's evidence from the very beginning. Before anyone could continue examining the archives, an alarm echoed through the underground chamber. Not electronic, mechanical. Somewhere deeper beneath the church, heavy gears slowly began turning. Dust drifted from the stone ceiling. One of the walls moved backward several inches, revealing a hidden corridor that none of the blueprints mentioned. At the far end of the passage stood a single wooden chair beneath a hanging lantern. Sitting calmly in that chair was Evelyn Carter. She looked up at Rebecca and Brooks with the same gentle smile she had worn every morning for 15 years. She was not alone. Standing beside her was an elderly man with silver hair, round glasses, and a weathered pocket watch hanging from his vest. Evelyn quietly reached for his hand before speaking only 4 words that left the entire task force speechless. "I'd like you to meet Richard." For several long seconds, nobody inside the underground archive moved. Every FBI agent stared at the elderly man standing beside Evelyn Carter, unable to accept that Richard Carter was alive after 15 years. Detective Daniel Brooks slowly lowered his weapon, while Rebecca Collins watched Richard with the cautious expression of someone who had spent an entire career learning that impossible things usually carried the highest price. Richard stood quietly beneath the hanging lantern wearing an old gray coat covered with dust, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands steady despite the rifles pointed toward him. He did not look like a fugitive. He looked like a retired grandfather who had simply grown tired of hiding. Evelyn stepped closer and gently held his hand before speaking. She said she was sorry they had finally found him. Richard smiled softly and answered that it had always been part of the plan. Brooks immediately asked why a dead man would spend 15 years hiding beneath abandoned churches instead of asking for protection. Richard replied that protection only existed on paper because the people assigned to protect witnesses had been compromised decades ago. He explained that every official safe house eventually became known to the organization they were trying to escape. Every relocation leaked. Every new identity disappeared. Every witness who trusted the system eventually vanished. The only way to survive was to disappear outside the system completely. Rebecca quietly asked who helped him remain invisible for so many years. Richard slowly walked toward the shelves lining the underground chamber and removed several worn notebooks. Each notebook carried a different year written across the cover. Inside were handwritten reports documenting unusual deaths, missing investigators, suspicious court rulings, unexplained fires, destroyed archives, and names of officials quietly transferred after asking too many questions. Every report ended with the same signature, a simple drawing of a white rose. Richard explained that 47 ordinary people across the country had agreed to become caretakers. They were not spies. They were not soldiers. They were school janitors, church volunteers, librarians, cemetery keepers, gardeners, mechanics, retired nurses, and elderly couples who lived ordinary lives while secretly protecting pieces of evidence nobody else could be trusted with. Brooks realized the gardens had never been graves alone. They had become a living archive spread across the country. Richard smiled sadly and admitted that most caretakers had never even met one another. If one disappeared, the others remained unknown. Rebecca slowly turned the pages of another notebook before stopping at a photograph clipped between two entries. It showed Richard Hawthorne standing beside Evelyn nearly 20 years earlier. Behind them stood Judge Harold Simmons, journalist Laura Bennett, FBI informant Michael Turner, and nearly 30 other smiling faces gathered outside a small farmhouse. Rebecca immediately recognized 4 of them as people officially listed as murdered or missing. Brooks studied every face carefully until one unfamiliar woman caught his attention. She looked remarkably similar to Evelyn, although much younger. Brooks quietly asked who she was. Richard looked at the photograph for several seconds before answering that her name had been Naomi Carter. Evelyn closed her eyes as tears slowly formed. Brooks asked whether Naomi was Evelyn's sister. Richard gently shook his head. He said Naomi was Evelyn's daughter. Silence filled the archive. Rebecca looked at Evelyn in complete disbelief, because every official record stated that Evelyn had never had children. Richard slowly explained that the records had been rewritten after the convoy attack. Naomi had entered federal protection at the age of 8, after witnessing the murder of a senior prosecutor. She was never supposed to exist again. Every birth certificate, every school record, every medical file, every photograph connected to her childhood had been erased. The government declared her legally dead, so the organization could never find her. Brooks quietly asked whether she survived. Richard lowered his eyes. He answered that nobody knew. The convoy carrying Naomi separated from theirs only minutes before the ambush. Radio communication ended shortly afterward. Every marshal assigned to her disappeared. Rebecca suddenly understood something that had bothered her since the investigation began. She asked Evelyn why she had spent 15 years protecting gardens instead of searching for her daughter. Evelyn looked directly into Rebecca's eyes before quietly answering that she had searched every single day. Richard added that every hidden archive contained one additional purpose besides protecting evidence. Every caretaker also searched for missing witnesses whose identities had been erased. Hundreds of anonymous reports arrived every year from people claiming to recognize faces believed dead. Most proved false. A few did not. Brooks looked toward a large wall map covered with colored pins and noticed several recent additions clustered around the eastern states. Richard explained that someone had begun hunting the caretakers one by one during the last 6 months. 7 had already disappeared. 3 were confirmed dead. 5 gardens had been destroyed before the FBI found Evelyn. Rebecca immediately asked who was leading the attacks. Richard slowly shook his head, because nobody had ever seen the true leadership. Orders always arrived through intermediaries. Faces changed. Names changed. Governments changed. Only one symbol remained the same. He walked toward another cabinet and removed a weathered leather folder, sealed with black wax. Pressed into the wax was a simple emblem shaped like a circle surrounding a single white rose. Brooks felt his heartbeat quicken, because he had seen that symbol once before inside an unsolved federal intelligence report that disappeared less than 24 hours after he requested access. Rebecca carefully opened the folder expecting more evidence, but instead found a stack of recent surveillance photographs. The first showed Evelyn watering her garden 3 weeks earlier. The second showed Brooks leaving his apartment 5 days ago. The third showed Rebecca entering FBI headquarters the previous morning. The fourth had been taken less than 2 hours earlier inside the underground archive where they were standing. Every person in the room stared at the final photograph in horror, because it showed the exact conversation they were having from an angle that should have been impossible. Someone had been watching them inside the hidden chamber all along. Before anyone could react, every lantern hanging from the ceiling suddenly went dark. A calm male voice echoed through unseen speakers hidden somewhere beyond the stone walls. The voice laughed softly before saying only one sentence. "You finally found the archive. Now let us show you who has been right." The underground archive disappeared into complete darkness the moment the unseen voice finished speaking. No emergency lights activated. No backup generators started. The only sound came from the steady breathing of nearly 20 FBI agents standing motionless beneath the ruined church. Detective Daniel Brooks tightened his grip on his flashlight, but when he pressed the switch, nothing happened. Every battery inside the chamber had somehow failed at the exact same moment. Rebecca Collins immediately ordered everyone to hold their positions. Nobody moved. Nobody fired. Richard Carter quietly whispered that this was exactly how they always began. Brooks asked who he meant, but Richard did not answer. Instead, he slowly reached into his coat pocket and removed an old mechanical lighter. A tiny flame flickered to life, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The weak orange light revealed hundreds of framed photographs hanging where nobody had noticed them before. Every photograph showed ordinary people: teachers, police officers, doctors, journalists, construction workers, elderly couples, children playing in parks, families eating dinner. At first, they appeared completely unrelated. Then Brooks noticed something disturbing. Every photograph contained the same small detail. Somewhere in the background stood the same man wearing different clothes. Sometimes he appeared as a gardener trimming bushes. Sometimes as a janitor pushing a mop through a courthouse hallway. Sometimes as a maintenance worker repairing traffic lights. Sometimes as a priest leaving a church. Sometimes as an elderly tourist feeding pigeons. The face barely changed, only the hair, the beard, the glasses, and the clothing. Rebecca slowly stepped closer to one photograph, then another, then another. Her expression hardened. The man was present in every single image taken across more than 30 years. Richard quietly said that nobody ever noticed invisible people. Brooks immediately remembered how easily people ignored cleaners, repairmen, delivery drivers, and maintenance workers. Richard nodded before Brooks even spoke. He explained that powerful organizations rarely survived because of famous leaders. They survived because ordinary people never questioned those standing quietly in the background. Rebecca asked whether the mysterious man was the leader of the conspiracy. Richard slowly shook his head. He answered that nobody knew his real name. Caretakers simply called him the Collector, because every time someone disappeared, he arrived afterward to collect whatever remained. Brooks studied another photograph showing an old courthouse from 20 years earlier. Standing beside the entrance was the same man dressed as a window cleaner. Another photograph showed the convoy attack site only hours before the ambush. The same face appeared again, this time disguised as a highway maintenance worker installing road signs. Richard explained that every investigation eventually crossed paths with him, yet nobody remembered seeing him, because he always looked exactly like someone who belonged there. Rebecca suddenly realized why every official inquiry had failed. Investigators searched for criminals. Nobody searched for custodians. One young FBI analyst hurried toward Rebecca carrying a tablet connected to the satellite network outside the church. Emergency communications had finally returned. Facial recognition software immediately compared the mysterious man's face against every federal database. After several long seconds, the system returned 0 matches. Brooks expected that. Then the analyst widened the search to include archived driver's licenses, passport records, military service photographs, employment files, hospital staff records, and immigration databases dating back 40 years. The computer finally produced a result. One face, one identity. Rebecca stared silently at the screen before turning it toward Richard. The photograph showed a young federal agent graduating from the academy nearly 35 years earlier. His name read Thomas Mercer. Richard looked at the picture for only a second before quietly saying it was another stolen identity. Brooks frowned. Richard explained that Thomas Mercer had disappeared 6 months after joining the Bureau. His body was never recovered. Yet someone had continued using his name for decades afterward. Rebecca immediately ordered Washington to reopen every missing federal employee case dating back 40 years. While agents searched the archive for more evidence, Brooks noticed one locked cabinet standing alone against the far wall. Unlike every other container, it carried no label, only a brass plate engraved with 2 words, "Do not open." Brooks looked toward Richard. Richard's face immediately changed. For the first time since revealing himself, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. He quietly told Brooks to leave it alone. Rebecca asked what was inside. Richard answered that some truths destroyed the people who learned them. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then a loud metallic click echoed from somewhere inside the cabinet. The lock slowly turned by itself. The heavy wooden doors creaked open without anyone touching them. Inside rested only a large leather ledger. Its pages appeared almost new despite decades underground. Rebecca carefully lifted the book onto a nearby table. Across the cover, written in faded black ink, were 4 simple words. Employee Attendance Register. Brooks looked confused. Richard closed his eyes. He whispered that it should have been destroyed years ago. Rebecca opened the first page. Hundreds of names filled in handwritten columns stretching back more than 30 years. Caretakers, witnesses, investigators, judges, informants. Every known victim connected to the conspiracy appeared somewhere inside the ledger. Then Brooks reached the final section. Unlike every previous page, these names were highlighted in red. Rebecca slowly read the first name aloud. Richard Carter. The second, Evelyn Carter. The third, Daniel Brooks. Brooks felt his blood run cold. Rebecca continued reading. Rebecca Collins. Every FBI agent currently standing inside the underground archive appeared on the list. Beside each name was a single handwritten word. Scheduled. Silence filled the chamber. Nobody understood what the word meant until Richard quietly turned to the final page. At the bottom, beneath every listed name, someone had written today's date. Beneath it appeared one final sentence in perfect handwriting. "Thank you for bringing everyone together. The collection is now complete." Nobody inside the underground archive spoke after Rebecca Collins finished reading the final sentence written inside the attendance ledger. "The collection is now complete." The words seemed impossible, yet every person standing in the chamber understood the terrifying implication. Someone had predicted their arrival before they ever entered Garden 7. Detective Daniel Brooks slowly looked around the room. 20 FBI agents. Rebecca Collins, Richard Carter, Evelyn Carter. Every one of them appeared inside the ledger beside today's date. It was not a list of victims. It was an appointment. Rebecca immediately ordered every exit secured. Tactical officers searched every corridor beneath the abandoned church while cyber specialists scanned for hidden transmitters. Nothing appeared. No cameras. No microphones. No heat signatures beyond the people already inside. Yet someone had known exactly who would enter the archive and precisely when. Brooks carefully examined the pages again. Every previous name listed in red had one additional mark beside it, a small black circle. Richard Carter's name carried no circle. Neither did Evelyn's. Neither did Rebecca's or Brooks'. Richard quietly explained that the circle always appeared after someone disappeared. Rebecca looked toward him. "You have seen this ledger before." Richard slowly nodded. "Only once." His voice became unusually quiet. 30 years ago. Brooks immediately asked where. Richard stared at the old book without blinking. Inside the first Genesis office, silence filled the chamber. Rebecca slowly closed the ledger. "You said Genesis was created to stop the organization." Richard answered with visible regret. That was true. He paused before continuing, "until someone stole it." Brooks frowned. Richard explained that Genesis had originally been nothing more than a confidential network created by judges, investigators, journalists, and honest federal agents who secretly shared evidence when official channels became compromised. Every member used anonymous identities. Every document existed in multiple locations. Every investigation was copied before corrupt officials could destroy it. Genesis was never meant to replace the law. It existed only to protect the truth until the law became strong enough to act. Rebecca quietly asked what changed. Richard looked toward Evelyn before answering. "Money." He explained that powerful people slowly infiltrated the network they could not destroy. They learned how Genesis stored information. They discovered how witnesses disappeared into safe houses. Eventually, they realized the same system protecting innocent people could also protect criminals. One by one, honest members vanished. Others accepted bribes. Some were murdered. Within only a few years, Genesis transformed from a secret defense network into something much darker. Brooks suddenly understood. The organization didn't build Genesis. Richard nodded slowly. It inherited it. Evelyn quietly added that everyone who resisted the transformation ended up inside gardens like the ones scattered across the country. Rebecca reopened the ledger and carefully turned to the earliest pages. Every name carried dates, locations, coded references, and handwritten notes. Then she reached the very first entry. Unlike every other page, the founder section contained only 5 names: Richard Carter, Judge Harold Simmons, Laura Bennett, Michael Turner. The final name made Rebecca stop breathing for a moment. Director William Hayes. Brooks recognized it instantly. William Hayes had served as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation nearly 30 years earlier. According to every history book, he died from a heart attack shortly after retiring. Richard quietly looked at the name. He created Genesis. Brooks slowly asked the question nobody wanted answered. Was he murdered? Richard answered immediately. No. Rebecca looked surprised. Richard continued. He betrayed us. Silence returned. Richard explained that Hayes secretly accepted enormous payments from the very people Genesis had been fighting. Every safe house location, every witness identity, every undercover investigation eventually reached the criminals through the director himself. Nobody suspected him because nobody imagined the highest law enforcement officer in the country would become the conspiracy's greatest weapon. Evelyn quietly whispered that everything collapsed after Hayes disappeared. Brooks looked confused. Disappeared. Richard nodded. Officially, he died. He smiled without humor. Officially. Rebecca suddenly looked toward the ledger again. She noticed something hidden beneath the first page. A folded sheet of yellow paper rested inside a narrow pocket built into the cover. She carefully unfolded it. It contained a single photograph. 5 smiling founders stood together outside a federal courthouse 30 years earlier. Richard appeared much younger. Judge Simmons looked proud. Laura Bennett held a camera over one shoulder. Michael Turner laughed at something outside the frame. Director William Hayes stood in the middle with one arm resting across Richard's shoulder. Brooks looked closely at the background. His heartbeat immediately accelerated. Standing behind the group was an elderly janitor pushing a cleaning cart across the courthouse steps. Rebecca noticed him at the same moment. The man's face matched every surveillance photograph recovered earlier. The same invisible maintenance worker. The same mysterious observer appearing throughout 3 decades of history. Richard slowly closed his eyes. He was there from the beginning. Rebecca whispered. The collector, Richard nodded. Before Genesis existed. Brooks quietly asked whether anyone knew his real identity. Richard answered with absolute certainty. Only one person ever did. Rebecca immediately looked at him. Who? Richard slowly pointed toward the final page of the attendance ledger. At the very bottom, beneath every scheduled name, another line of writing had quietly appeared. Nobody had seen the fresh ink forming across the paper. It had not been there moments earlier. Every person in the room watched in complete silence as the final sentence finished writing itself. If you wish to meet the collector, ask director Rebecca Collins why she has never spoken about her father. Rebecca's face instantly lost all color. Brooks slowly turned toward her. She had never mentioned her father to anyone on the task force. Before anyone could speak, Rebecca quietly whispered 4 words that shattered every assumption they had made since the investigation began. My father died cleaning courthouses.